This podcast is brought to you by NHS England. NHS Citizen is a national initiative by NHS England to give the public a voice on healthcare matters and influence NHS decision making.
Hi everyone and welcome to this podcast. My name is Nithya Bennett. Today, we're at NHS England Quarry House in Leeds and I'm going to talk to you about the recent launch of the National Quality Board and NHS England guidance for NHS trusts on engaging with bereaved families. To discuss the launch of the guidance and to share her experience working with NHS England, today in our office is Rosi Reed. Rosie's son Nico had cerebral palsy and died in the care of Ridgeway Partnership Trust. Rosie has campaigned to challenge how she and her family were treated following Nico's death and the failings in the care he received. Rosie, thank you so much for coming to Leeds and for your incredible strength and for sharing your story with us. So would you like to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yes, fine, absolutely. I'm not sure about the incredible strength part, but okay, so a little bit of background on me. My name is Rosie Reed. For many years, I was a dancer and then I retired from professional dancing and I started my own dance production company, which included doing some teaching. Actually, I retire from doing that in exactly 4 weeks from now.
Oh, that's brilliant. And how do you feel about that?
Okay, quite good actually, but don't tell my students.
So do you think your experience as a dancer contributes to your inner strength, Rosie?
I think there may be some truth in that. When you're a young dancer, you very quickly learn that it's a highly competitive industry, to put it mildly. You need to be very strong and very clear about what you want. You need to be very driven. Talent alone is not enough. And the old cliche about dancing through the pain is absolutely true. You have to go on stage and perform even when you're ill.
And could you tell us about Making Families Count and your association with the NHS post Nico's death?
I'm sure you can imagine there I was until August 2012. We were not some kind of picture-perfect family, but we were an ordinary, happy family living our lives. And my son's very sudden and unexpected death just brought our world crashing down, to be honest. And anybody who's listening to this, who has lost somebody they love very suddenly, will understand that you have to work through such a lot of different emotions and difficult situations, things you never thought you'd have to cope with, things you are not equipped to cope with. But then in very early 2015, I think it was February, I had a phone call from somebody I had met quite briefly, and this was a lady called Julie Carey. In my opinion, she is a most wonderful, exceptional person, and the NHS is very lucky to have her, and the world is lucky to have her. She had very recently begun to set up a new group together with a guy called Julian Hendy, who runs a charity called 100 Families. 100 Families being approximately the amount of families who are bereaved through mental health homicide in Britain every year. And they were looking for some family members to possibly join their group. And they were looking for a certain type of person, I realise now. And I was amazed that they asked me, because at that point, because of what we'd been through, my self-confidence was extremely low. I was struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder and everything that went with that. And I accepted it because I expected them to say after a few weeks, I'm sorry, this isn't going to work. But they didn't. The first one we went to was, I think it was in Reading. So it was probably the Berkshire Trust. And I was so overcome by the occasion that I didn't get up. I didn't speak. I didn't do any kind of presentation. I simply sat at the back of the room. My sole contribution was being in the room and watching a film about our experience that Julian Hendy, who is a documentary filmmaker, he had made. And I watched the room become hugely affected by watching this film. And for the first time, I realized that there were people out there that I hadn't met who actually cared what had happened to us. And that was a watershed moment. Well, that was over 3 years ago. And after 3 wonderful years with Making Families Count, we are now spinning out. We're going to become our own separate body. And I'm going to be one of the people running it.
Tell us a bit more about how working with Making Families Count makes you feel.
My work with Making Families Count has brought me a great deal of satisfaction. And I think that it is extremely timely and important work. Basically, for anybody who doesn't know anybody out there who doesn't know what we do, we are a training organisation, basically. We will go to any trust anywhere in the country. We mostly work with NHS trusts, but we are open to working with other bodies. We've done a few things with private health companies, but primarily we come to NHS trusts and we do a day's workshop in which we take you on a sort of bit of an arc of discovery, really. We start with, well, what does bad look like? And we illustrate that through some extremely powerful, hard-hitting, very moving films. And the people that the films are about are in the room and then do presentations. But we move from bad very gently through the day towards good. And on the way, we give you tools. We teach you what good looks like, what good can achieve, what it does for you, what it does for families. And people often start the day thinking, well, I don't know what this is going to be like, or this is going to be not very enjoyable, rather heavy, I don't know. But at the end of the day, we are simply swamped with staff members coming up to us saying, that has been the single most wonderful training day I have ever had. And we almost always get asked to go back, because the trust very often then want to develop our model and they want us to train staff in smaller groups in the model. So it is deeply fulfilling work on so many levels. And of course, it ties in with all the other work that I'm doing.
Can you tell us a little bit about your experience from Making Families Count to joining the Learning from Death's steering group for the development of this guidance? Could you walk us a little bit through your journey?
A lot of people have obviously heard me speak when they've attended Making Families Count training days. And one of those people invited me to join the Learning from Death's steering group. When I was asked to join, I was initially a little bit reluctant. It was going to be far more mainstream work than I'd done before. It was going to be really working from the inside, whereas before I'd been working from the outside. But I have to say, the work I've done has been extremely illuminating and helpful in so many ways, and has informed the work that I do with Making Families Count. And actually, very recently, I've also been working with the Patient Safety Investigation team, who are doing reviews on the Serious Incident Framework. And I found, again, meeting people through that, working with those people, has informed the work I do with Learning from Deaths and has informed the work I do with Making Families Count, because in the end, it's all about working with people from the NHS at many, many different levels, listening to what they have to say, thinking about what they're saying, encouraging everybody to go on a journey to good.
So, as a member of the public, how would you say yours and Nico's experience of the NHS was before this terrible incident?
Okay, well, that's a really good question. I mean, I'd like to say at this point straight away that I believe that the NHS is possibly one of the finest things that this country has. And I am incredibly proud of the NHS and incredibly proud to be British and to enjoy the privileges that the NHS gives us. And I would fight tooth and nail to keep it and keep it strong. I am in no way an NHS basher, and I don't have a lot of time for people who are. However, I think that prior to my son's death, like a lot of people in this country, I was naive without knowing I was naive. I imagined in some way that everybody who worked for the NHS had such a strong moral compass, that they were in some way high above anything such as lying or covering up, if I ever thought about it at all. And then I was very, very shocked with what happened after Nico died. I was so shocked And then the shock continued as little by little I began to realize that in fact my experience was not that rare. And that made me realize that it wasn't enough just to love and value the NHS. I needed to be part of the fight to make it into the best version of itself that it could possibly be. In the work that I've done over the last few months, and I'm talking about making families count, people I've met from various trusts, learning from deaths, and the patient safety work, I am sorry to say I have come across staff who honestly don't think the current system needs fixing. I've come across staff who think that it's the family's fault when engagement with them is poor. I've met a very defensive and arrogant culture which feels that it's closed and resistant to change. Now, I'm not for a moment here talking about everybody. I'm not. I'm talking about some people. But unfortunately, there's enough of them that make me realize that we really, really need to change. I've met a lot of staff who seem to think only in terms of their trust. And they don't see the NHS as a whole. And as a consequence, they seem to feel that the learning from death guidance is being handed down to them from on high, from people who don't understand what it's like to work at their trust, and they don't understand what it's like to work on the front line. I think it's more complicated than that.
And do you think the problem isn't the NHS as a whole, but the culture of working in silos?
I'd like to draw a parallel just for a moment. I think we all remember, I hope everyone listening remembers the Stephen Lawrence case. And it was an absolute watershed moment for the police force. And it's strange to think now we think about family liaison officers as being part and parcel, but before Stephen Lawrence, there were none. How can it be that the police can have looked at their own house and said, something is very wrong here, we must change it, and the NHS cannot? The NHS is a very, very large publicly funded body who therefore need to be able to be utterly transparent to all. We cannot have a culture of defensiveness and arrogance and truth concealing. That's not acceptable, and it is at odds with an ethos of health and healing. Because when you put a family through the experience of having to fight to get to the truth, that family is mentally and emotionally damaged by the fight. And the trust is responsible for what has happened to them. And that needs to change.
Do you feel bereaved families need to have a voice in influencing the NHS? And do you think this guidance, it represents that?
Families are not given equal status in an investigation, and there's a thing that I call a hierarchy of evidence. And by that I mean the trust places more importance on the evidence given by professional staff than that given by the family. In investigations, we frequently hear statements about staff sharing facts and staff giving evidence, whereas families tend to be written as having opinions. Professionals apparently know, where families are frequently described as having feeling, or they felt as if, even when families actually have hard evidence to back up what they're saying. By diminishing the status of families in investigations, the trust is actually losing out. We see families as being what I describe as a thin red line, which runs throughout the investigation narrative, and very often they're the only constant. With a lot of investigations, they become multi-organisational. They're often not just about that one department, that one trust, and very often the only people present at every meeting and every discussion were the family. So if along the way in the investigation you lose the family, or fail to listen to the family, or fail to give them any importance in your investigation, then your investigation will already have failed. I think we need to remember the purpose of an investigation. Now, you may disagree with me, but I think it's about two things. First thing, it gives a faithful, transparent and truthful account of what happened leading up to the death and after. This allows the family to have the comfort of knowledge, and the trust gains an invaluable learning tool. However, all investigations are worthless if they deny the deceased person the honour and the respect of a truthful account. And investigations are worse and worthless if the trust refuses to learn from them. If a trust refuses to acknowledge wrongdoing and the need to make changes, then they are missing out on the opportunity to save more lives in the future. Making families count, sadly, have seen, and I do say sadly, I mean sadly because I don't want to be saying these things, but we have seen a widespread thirst for change amongst NHS staff, many of them desperate to see an end to cover-ups, to poor quality investigations and lying on this scale, and many see it as a stain on this fantastic organisation.
Do you think co-producing this guidance was a better way of working? And how have you found that experience?
I have really enjoyed the work and I've really enjoyed the experience. And I feel privileged to have had the opportunity to participate in this important work. There's been a lot of positives for me. One of them has been meeting and talking to the family members who came to our family listening day. When you have a traumatic bereavement, your particular case becomes your world entire. Very often you don't know anybody who's been through what you've been through. You've never met anybody else like you. And when you suddenly find yourself in a room with dozens and dozens and dozens of people, and when you talk to them and listen to them, their stories reflect yours. It is moving and empowering. And I realized as these days went on that it wasn't just myself and the other family members on the steering group that were feeling this. The families we were talking to were feeling it too. It became like a type of networking, but also working with some of the great NHS staff on the group who are genuinely committed to overhauling and improving the system. I've learnt a huge amount from this work and from them about how NHS investigations work, how the current system works or doesn't. I've learnt about duty of candour in action or not in action sometimes. And I've got a much more rounded and informed understanding about what is going on now, what is going wrong, and the effect that that is having on families and on staff. I've learnt a huge amount from my fellow colleagues. Their courage, their never-ending capacity to take on yet more work, and their sense of humour has enriched me. I've realised that making important and positive changes to the system, it isn't just going to benefit families, but it's also going to benefit staff, and it's going to benefit families yet to come.
And in your journey of working on the guidance, have you found something that came across as disappointing and it could be better?
I think the main thing I've come across, which has been disappointing, there has been a failure to acknowledge from some NHS staff members, and in particular, perhaps people at a higher level, a failure to acknowledge that this work has to happen, must happen, is dreadfully needed. That has disappointed me. I've also come across people who really are still trapped in a culture of blaming the family when things go wrong, or even worse, blaming the deceased person. And that saddens me enormously.
So this Learning from Death's guidance is produced for NHS trusts on engaging with bereaved families. So do you think this was necessary?
There's a lot of people who seem to think that the work isn't necessary, that somehow each trust will just fix itself, and that we're giving them unnecessary work now and just getting in their way. They're misguided on that. But perhaps they won't realise just how misguided until they are working with the new guidance and seeing the benefits it can bring, if we can land it as well as it needs to be landed.
Would you like to talk us through your experience working on this guidance and also tell us a bit about your feedback and the negative comments you've received on social media?
I have been, I think we could say, strongly criticised on social media for simply taking part in this work. There is a certain element on social media which views the NHS as evil, and anybody who works with them becomes tainted by association. Sadly, these people are very often people who have had really, really dreadful things done to them by NHS trusts and people that work for them. So their negative feelings are based in a very negative personal experience, which I can't do anything personally to change, I don't think. There's also been a lot of criticism on social media, which has been principally aimed at the steering group about how long it's taken to land the guidance. And of course, the truth is, it's people like me that have slowed it down. We've gone back and demanded change after change. We've demanded rethinks, rewrites many, many times along the way. And then, of course, the family listening days were an absolute game changer. And out of them, we basically went away and threw the whole thing out and started again, because it was as if we had been handed this incredible book on which was written an unassailable truth. And we felt such a weight of responsibility to these families. We could not let them down. We had to land a guidance which was going to give them back a degree of dignity and power and truth and compassion. And we couldn't fail them. And that meant as well that we had to make sure the architecture for this guidance is really robust. And getting that right has caused a lot of delays. But if the architecture isn't right, then the guidance won't work properly. And all of this work will have been wasted. And we will just have to start again.
So, thinking about the positives then, after working collaboratively with families and trusts, how will this guidance impact or influence the NHS?
There are many positives. There are the positives of what will happen when it lands. Ideally, what we are working for and what we are hoping for is that there will be 2 clear strands of guidance. One is for trust members to follow, one is for families to follow. And we hope that in its different ways, this is going to be a game changer. For families, it's going to mean that they will know exactly what to expect, what will happen, and if it doesn't happen, they will know what to do next. Because the idea of keeping families in the dark, without information, without status, without any real kind of support, that does not belong in a modern caring NHS system. That can't be. So the guidance for families is to help them and support them through potentially the most awful time in their lives. The guidance for trusts also supports them to an awful time in their life because it gives them clear information on what they need to do. And we hope that the effect it will have when it lands is that it will encourage more staff members to see a working partnership with families after a death so that everybody gains and the lessons that are learned will truly save lives in the future.
Rosie, in your opinion, what approach would make this guidance a success?
If we get this right, families will know what to expect and trust staff will deliver it in a kind, timely, transparent and robust way. And actually, I think the true value of this piece of work, the true value of the guidance, will only be known when there is another death. This time round, the trust involved will not traumatise the family further and force them to grieve twice, once for the loss of their loved one and once for their inability to battle with the trust to get the truth. If a culture isn't learning from its mistakes and it isn't being open to the value of change, then it ceases to be a beacon of hope. And the NHS must be a shining light for the British people. It cannot be allowed to become a focus of despair for any more families.
Do you think that we should stop the blame culture when mistakes happen?
Fair blame culture says, okay, we've done a very good investigation, a really robust and thorough and transparent investigation, and we can see exactly what went wrong. And there are some key people here who have made mistakes. And we name them, and we name the mistakes because that's how we learn from them. But a fair blame culture teaches and encourages, a no blame culture sadly can be misused to allow people who should be reprimanded to go unpunished.
And once the guidance is launched, what will good look like to you? And what needs to be done for this guidance to land well?
How it's going to land well with families, the proof of the pudding is going to be in the eating, as they say. We won't really know how successful it is with families until we have, sadly, some deaths, and then we have the families encountering the guidance for the first time. And I think we need to monitor that very carefully, because we on the steering group that are family members have tried so hard to think, well, that was us, not if it was us. It was us. What do we want? But we need to monitor and see if the families find it helpful. And we need to not be afraid of tweaking it or overhauling it, because if it isn't quite right, then we have to change it. We can't have another system that we know is flawed and yet we just carry on with it and possibly risk damaging more families. That isn't going to work. When it comes to NHS staff, it's going to need to be embedded through rigorous training. We absolutely cannot just publish this guidance and expect it to stick, because if it's going to be resilient and robust through potentially some very difficult situations, then we must make sure that every single trust member who has it in their hand and reads it understands what they do.
Can you think of a good practice example from an NHS trust when things went wrong?
One of my colleagues at Making Families Count, actually, she has very recently retired from us. She's gone off to live the good life down by the seaside, and we wish her a lot of luck. But she had what I would call a better experience. I'd hesitate to call it a good experience, because it began with a mental health homicide of somebody very dear to her indeed. So not good. But the trust involved did their best. And when they realised, when the investigation made it clear that they were vastly at fault and had committed a very grievous error, they held their hands up to it straight away and did everything they could to demonstrate that they had learnt from it and put into place really meaningful change. And they sent her a letter, which was, yes, a letter of apology, but it went further than that. It apologised unreservedly. It named what they were apologising for, and it said what they were going to do now, so that in the name of the person who died, good would come from it. And that meant a huge amount and was hugely healing.
Would you like to share any personal message to all the families listening to this podcast?
Okay, I'm actually going to begin by saying something to NHS staff. But of course, by saying it to NHS staff, I'm also saying it to families, because one of the things I've come across in all my work with its various names and labels in the last few years is the existence in the NHS of a them and us culture. And I think this starts because, particularly for staff on the front line, the work they do is so intense, so overwhelming, so very difficult that they can protect themselves by living in that NHS bubble. But from there, it becomes all too easy to start to think everybody outside that bubble is other than yourself. And then it evolves. And so I come across a culture where staff talk about, we are like this, but they are like that. And families become this catch-all term for these troublesome people who won't listen and are difficult to cope with. And as a woman said to me just a couple of weeks ago, how can I go and talk to a family when all they're doing is sitting there and weeping? And I said to her, well, what's wrong with them weeping? Grief's not infectious. That doesn't mean just because they're weeping that they haven't got something sensible to tell you and something incredibly useful to tell you, even if they cry at the same time. But the other thing, sadly, is there is no them and us, because whatever you do for a living, traumatic grief doesn't care. And there are so many trust staff out there whose lives have already been touched by traumatic grief. I meet people all the time who want to sit and hold my hand in the breaks on training days and tell me about somebody very dear to them that they've lost to suicide or to poor care or in any other way. And they are NHS staff, but they are also families, and their lives have been blighted. So we must take away the them and us culture, because there is only us at the end of the day. And to families, I would say, when this happens, it is terrible and you feel that you're very alone. It's hard to imagine that there can be anybody else out there who has ever been through what you're going through and might understand, because you will be surrounded by people who don't understand. But there are many people that do understand. And we are all holding out our hands to you and saying, we are here to support you. We are here to catch you. We are here to work with you to make this pain a little less awful. And if we get this guidance right, some of those people will be NHS staff.
Thank you, Rosie, for giving us your time and for sharing your experience with us. And a big thanks to all the families who've contributed in developing this Learning from Death's guidance for trusts and the information for bereaved families leaflet. You can find it on the NHS England website.
You were listening to an NHS England podcast brought to you by NHS Citizen.